In this unit, we're going to do a brief introduction to Active Directory. You could take an entire course on Active Directory, obviously, and in fact, the follow-on to this course is mostly about Active Directory. So this is kind of a nice preview of what you can expect in the next course, where we get into a lot more detail on Active Directory. The purpose in this course, obviously, was to give you sort of to level set everyone and give you a baseline of how Windows Server 2012 works and all the different features we have, which, of course, all play a role in many networks. And then Active Directory is kind of the superpower for Microsoft Windows Server. I think if you look at most major organizations, really almost every organization, is using Active Directory for authentication on their network. Even if you have a lot of infrastructure that's running Unix and Linux and so forth, there's a good chance that you're using Active Directory to manage the overall authentication. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of companies that even are in different areas in technology, that are other technology companies, have some components that might be using Active Directory. So Active Directory is a pretty powerful part of Windows Server, and I'm just going to give you an introduction, as I said, in this unit, in this course, and you can learn a lot more about Active Directory later on. I would certainly encourage you to learn a lot more about Active Directory, because I think you'll find that this is probably the most common use for Windows Server 2012 or 2016 is as an Active Directory server. So let's get started. Let's start going through Active Directory. So our objectives in this unit, first we're going to describe the role of a directory service. Then I'm going to go through the installation for Active Directory. I'm going to talk about some of the objects that you might find in Active Directory. We'll talk about forest, trees, and domains and how all that stuff works. And then finally, I'll talk about group policies, which, again, you could take half of a class on just group policies. They get pretty complicated, and there's a lot of interesting things we can do with those. So first, what exactly is directory services? So a network directory service stores information about a computer network and offers features for retrieving and managing that information, generally considered to be an administrative tool, but users make use of of directory services to find resources on the network. So directory services provide a centralized management tool, but due to complexity requires careful planning prior to setup. So in the old days, going back in time here, X.500 was the basis for the hierarchical structure that you're going to see here in Active Directory. X.500, there was also a lightweight version of it called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which is sort of based on X.500, Directory Access Protocol. It uses TCP/IP, so it's a little bit better than the old X.500. But if you're going to integrate Active Directory in Windows to Linux or Unix or other operating systems, and even platforms outside the Microsoft ecosystem, they may run on Windows, but unless you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, it's difficult to integrate directly with Active Directory. So a lot of that stuff will use LDAP. When you hear about single sign-on, a lot of times single sign-on applications that are outside of the Microsoft ecosystem are using something like LDAP. So there's a good chance that you'll have to implement LDAP as well. And luckily, Active Directory gives us an LDAP capability. So it has a LDAP compatible interface where you can use LDIF commands and so forth with an Active Directory server. So generically, what exactly is a directory service? And I can summarize by saying that a directory service or a network directory service is basically a database. So at the end of the day, if you've taken a database class, you can take a lot of the concepts that you learned about databases and sort of apply it to what we're talking about with directory services, with network directory services and Active Directory. It's a different kind of database, though. It's a distributed database and it's a hierarchical database. Whereas something that you learn about in a database class, for example, if you took a database class and you learned about Oracle or Microsoft SQL Server, you probably learned about relational database management systems, and that's definitely not what what directory services uses. It's a hierarchical database structure, so it's a little bit different, but some of the concepts are somewhat similar. So again, if you're not familiar with what directory services is, try to put it in perspective of being a database and think about it as a giant database, but it's got a hierarchical structure as opposed to a relational structure. So when you think about a relational database management system, it's a two-dimensional table. So you have rows and columns, and tables relate to one another, right? Through foreign key constraints and things like that you learned about in the database class. In a hierarchical database, you can think of it more like a file system, right? So if you look at any computer that you use, it probably has a hierarchical file system. You have a root, and then below that root you have folders, and then within those folders you have folders and so forth until you get to objects, which might be files. A directory services hierarchical structure is very similar to that. You have a root, and then below that you have things that are subordinate to that root as you go deeper and deeper into that hierarchical structure. It basically looks like a tree that's upside down, or I could say a tree with roots, right? Um, so that's basically what it is. And just like in a relational database management system, you have schemas that define what you're allowed to put in a table, the structure of those tables, the what the data types are. A lot of that stuff is also defined in a directory service when it's hierarchical. So but one thing that is very different about hierarchical is everything about an object is stored in that object's in that object's location physically. So with a relational database, you might have a person that has an address and a phone number and classes if it's a school database or something like that, right? And they have all these different tables that relate to one another. You don't have that in a hierarchical database. Instead, everything you need to know about, for example, if it were a student, everything you would need to know about a student would be in that student's record, and you wouldn't have relations that go to other places. It's all in one spot. And the unique identifier is the combination of all of the hierarchical structure that is to which they are subordinate. So just a kind of a quick primer on what these hierarchical databases mean. So I just wanted to kind of frame that for you before we move forward. So Active Directory offers some features. It's a hierarchical database structure, which I just talked about. It's centralized, but also distributed. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. What does it distributed mean? There is no one central authority typically when you're distributed. Now, the way that Microsoft implements this hierarchical database is there is a central authority, but it's distributed, but then there is some central authorities for certain pieces of it that have to be centrally managed, but a lot of it is very distributed. It has scalability. Microsoft's Active Directory can scale up to the largest organizations in the world. So it's used by governments and things like that. It's everywhere, and it definitely can scale to the largest organizations that you can think of. It has a lot of security features. It is one of the main tools that we have in our security tools for securing networks, because it handles a lot of our authentication and authorization on the network. And it does have a pretty powerful suite of products that allow us to do that. We're going to talk about things like group policy that really give us a lot of control over security. It has a lot of flexibility, and it's a policy-based administration. So it kind of sounds like Microsoft marketing, but those are some of the benefits of using Active Directory. So you have in the structure, there's the way when you look at the structure, it has really two structures. There's the physical structure, which is sites and servers configured as domain controllers. So you have, in the physical structure, you might have a domain, and then below that domain, you've got your objects and your users and so forth and so on. And that might be the physical structure. The logical structure, on the other hand, makes it possible to pattern directory services after the organization in which it runs. So thinking about this, if you think about an organization, think about a pretty good-sized organization. You might have offices strewn all over the country in a large organization. And the physical structure of that company would be an office in Los Angeles, an office in New York, and so forth and so on. And you would have to plan for that physical infrastructure to mirror that. But the reality is that the logical structure of that company, you probably have the accounting department, for example, probably has a presence in all of those offices. The sales department might have a presence in all of those offices. Manufacturing might have a presence in only 2 or 3 of those offices. Engineering might have a presence in 2 or 3 other offices, and so forth, and different business units, and so forth and so on. So what Active Directory lets you do is not only have that physical structure, but also that logical structure of the actual hierarchy of the organization, but it doesn't have to be the same as the physical structure. So we'll talk a little about some of the mechanisms that let you do that. So the physical structure, so Active Directory site or a site in Active Directory is just a physical location in which a domain controller communicates and replicates information regularly. So basically in Active Directory you have to set up these sites so that, I talked about how you have this distributed database. It's distributed to all these different servers all across the organization. And in order for that to work efficiently, the Active Directory servers have to understand where they are physically to one another so they understand how to most efficiently do that replication. For example, you wouldn't want to be doing real-time replication between a server that's over a really slow WAN in a remote office that only has 6 users, right? So there's some efficiency that you can have there when that understanding of the physical structure is understood by the domain controller. Each domain controller contains a full replica of the objects that make up the domain and is responsible for. So in other words, with that distributed database, every domain controller knows or has a replica of all of the information within its own domain. And we'll talk a little bit about what a domain is in just a few minutes versus forest trees and so forth. So storing a copy of the domain data and replicating changes the data to all of the other domain controllers within the domain. It's basically what a domain controller does. It can provide data search and retrieval functions for users attempting to locate objects in the directory and provides authentication and authorization services for users who log on to the domain. And this is probably one of the big things that Active Directory does for us is centralized authentication and authorization. So, gone are the days when an IT person would manage user accounts across the enterprise on individual servers and individual workstations. That would be unthinkable today in a large organization to have local control over user accounts. That's insane. It would take, if you have 50,000 users in the network, there's no way you could manage that, in a centralized way. So you'd have to rely on individuals to manage their own accounts, and there's lots of issues with that. So Active Directory certainly gives us a really good tool to do that. You may be wondering, before we had Active Directory, what commonly did that. And for the most part, before Active Directory, there was another product called Novell. And Novell had a network operating system that they marketed that was probably one of the most common network operating systems until Windows Server 2000 came out. I think prior to Windows 2000, Novell was pretty common. And they were kind of competitors for a while, Microsoft and Novell. But today, it's very rare to see Novell. It's almost exclusively, this market is almost exclusively dominated by Microsoft products. So it's certainly good to understand these Microsoft products because they're everywhere. We could talk about how great Linux is, and I would agree, Linux is great. I love Linux. But Linux is typically not the source of truth for authentication, authorization, and permissions on networks. Usually that's coming from Active Directory through something like LDAP. But like I said, we can integrate these different platforms, which we'll talk about later on. So there's 4 organizing components of Active Directory. So 4 ways you can organize things. There's organizational units, or OUs for short. You'll hear that term a lot. Then you have domains, trees, and forests. So, and how that works is a forest contains trees, and trees contain domains. And across all of those, you have your organizational units. So for the most part, domains, trees, and forests is that physical structure I talked about, whereas the organizational units is more of that logical structure that I talked about before. So the OU is a container used to organize networks, users, and resources into logical administrative units, as I described before. So an OU contains Active Directory objects such as user accounts, groups, computer accounts, printers, shared folders, applications, servers, domain controllers. All of these things are objects which would be stored, or which an OU can contain. So when you create an OU, it can contain any or all of those different types of objects. A domain is the core structural unit of Active Directory. So it all kind of starts with domains. So contains OUs and represents administrative security and policy boundaries. So small to medium companies typically only have one domain. But larger companies can have many domains to separate geographical regions or administrative responsibilities or even different business units. A tree is a grouping of domains. Let me take a step back here. So we have domains. Many companies, small to medium companies, may only have one giant domain, but large organizations have more than one domain typically. And all of those domains are, when you group those domains together, they become a tree. So a tree is a group of domains. Okay, so it can consist of a parent domain and possibly one or more children domains or child domains. And then a forest is the collection of all of the trees. So at the highest level, you have a forest. Within the forest, you have trees, and those trees have domains, and the domains can have leaf objects, which we're going to talk about later on. So all domains in all trees can communicate and share information. So in other words, if you, just because you have different domains and different trees, as long as they're all part of the same forest, they can all communicate with one another. So they can all communicate. Okay, so let me show you an example. So here we have a forest of 2 trees, and at the bottom there you can see we have subordinate domains of those 2 trees. So we have 2 trees there, and those 2 trees have a root and 2 children. I should tell you that in the real world, you probably wouldn't see a forest that looks like this. I'm going to show you a more real-world example later on in this unit. So towards the end of this unit, we'll look at this picture again, but you're going to see it looks a little bit different. I think it would be difficult to set up a Active Directory forest that looks like this because you always have to have at least one root domain. So we'll talk about that later on, but you really have to have one root, and this one doesn't have that, obviously. So we'll see that later on. All right, in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about how to install Active Directory.